Uh, Welcome to GASC Tel Aviv, hosted virtually the third day, June the 16th, our third session. My name is Andrew Bartlett, and I'll be moderating. We have two presenters, Magdalena Złocka-Dąbrowska and Ian Dennis, and we'll hear one paper and then take questions on that paper, and then hear the second and take questions on it separately, just because I think the papers are probably a little bit different. So I'll first introduce the first speaker. Magdalena Złocka-Dąbrowska is adjunct professor of anthropology at the Cardinal Stefan Wyszynsky University in Warsaw, and a member of GASC since 2015. She's the author of a book, Analyse de l'œuvre de Georges Dumézil, Un maître à penser, 2013. And she has edited a second book, Generative Anthropology and Transdisciplinary Inquiry, Religion, Science, Language, and Culture, Warsaw, 2018. Her articles, Kratos and Cognition, Gans and Dumézil in Dialogue on Language and Violence, Generative Anthropology in the Cosmic Realms of the Mahabharata, Generative Anthropology, Scene of Origin in Cognitive and Axiological Contexts, Kratos, Crisis and Cognition in reference to GA and the Scene of Language, Culture, Origin, GA Among Giants, Gans' Scene of Language and Culture, Origin in reference to Cassirer and Heidegger's Visions of the Human. All five enter into the pathway of originary and scenic logic. Magdalena was the organizer of the 2018 GASC, which was held at the Cardinal Stefan Wyszynsky University in Warsaw. Magdalena, it's so great to have you with us again. And the title of her paper is From Cognitive to Neurocognitive Potentials of Gans' Scene of Origin. So take it away, Magdalena.
Thank you, Andrew, very much. I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to present something what is important for me, especially from the point of view of cognitive anthropology, which I am deeply interested in. And this year's conference was started by the idea of internal scene. And I might say that this internality we are looking for may be defined in some ways in the paper I'm presenting. And let's see how the scene works on three general levels: on representation as closely related to cognition and consciousness, and on the level of this internal body human construction, which is affected as a human brain. Thinking in a new way is Eric Gans's formula of GA and his contribution to better understanding of human and his place in the universe. It obliges us to focus on the core concept, the scene of origin, based on the mimetic triangle, where we argue representation rather than cognition, as well the brain are closely connected. To discuss this subject, it must be assumed that the representation, the center of Gans's model, expresses a cultural mind resulting from human cognitive abilities whose intent would not be possible without special properties of the human brain. Therefore, let me ask, was our species named Homo sapiens by chance? It seems rather for a reason that the species to which we belong has obtained such a designation. To present the already long existing human species obtained the form of a double sapiens, which strengthens its meaning as well as the significance of the applied classification. Were it not for Homo sapiens sapiens, GA would not exist. The etymology, according to the Latin sapiens, is based on the form of sapio as present active participle and its English equivalent, which means discern, be capable of discerning. In turn, the Polish translation from Latin sapiens designates, let me say in Polish, człowiek jako istota zdolna do myślenia refleksyjnego. That is a man being capable of reflective thinking. Both explanations unite in GA, where reflective thinking also in the broadest sense in contemporary humanities, including cultural anthropology, undergoing constant transformation process, a result of expanding the field of self-reflection and discernment, are essential for cynic humans who, while existing, remains in a state of incessant recognition of the surrounding world. Reflective thinking and discernment require such qualities which enable them to be carried out and encapsulated in human properties. They are closely related to each other and herald another direction of reading cynic association, reading of human entangles, as suggests Heidegger. GA as a theoretical concept, speaking of the human origin, reflects and discerns Homo sapiens, deeply entangled, together with his all capabilities of the unique mind as well as the unique brain. The scene itself can be understood as a connectionist formula which acts simultaneously on many levels, with some process already recognized and some to be still recognized, while being aware that the scope of all formal systems is limited and does not cover all the complexities or questions and answers. The connections in this scene occur primarily on the level of observation, well known in the anthropological research in which we mainly discover external processes. However, one might argue that the essential horizon of understanding of the scene of origin is on the cognitive level, which aims at explaining the human mind and behavior by means of the processes of cognitive systems. It functions as generative cognition that is characteristic for the human scene, where the awareness of the consequences of our choice of action determines future existence. However, humanities also model themselves on natural sciences, which are increasingly manifesting themselves in the world, suggesting new explanations. It is not enough to state that there are mechanisms of cognition present in the scene of origin. It should be added that there are mechanisms underlying cognition, and the practice itself is inspired by the understanding of the brain process. What is unique for human cognition? It is the person's relatedness, drive to create, which makes them unique among living creatures, takes to an internal process of the mind operation. Cognitive functions, also called cognitive processes or cognitive abilities, are used to acquire knowledge and shape behavior, condition the perception of the reality, and regulate the process relationship to the environment, including other people. Cognitive functions are influenced by the survival of organisms. Moreover, the principle expressed in the words of Professor Vetulani and applied to the next level, the brain, is as follows. The main goal of the brain is to survive. So, to produce a sign equals to survive. Highly advanced groups of primates to which man belongs are oriented towards understanding social actions planned and aimed at achieving a common goal. These in turn assumed and favored the development of linguistic communication. Already in the 70s of the 20th century, Hoppe, while studying the development of speech based on the analysis of action, created a model of all human and animal actions which demonstrates the subject-object relationship in which the subject goes to or from the object. Gans's scene coincides with this model, confirming the human-object relation. However, its other components are subsequent levels of explanation and remain unspoken. The scene requires a multiplicity of factors in which cognitive process appears as a reaction of or effect of the ongoing process. They occur simultaneously on almost simultaneously with cognitive process. However, despite the current advancement of methods and equipment, all the existing measures of time or measuring devices used in the experiments are imperfect. Still, these models help to understand the process taking place in the scene of origin. Moreover, many neurologists believe today that linguistic and manual skills are based on the same structures. According to Stout's preliminary research, tool-making as a complex manual and cognitive process influence the development of the hominid brain. There were significant neural changes that were later taken over to support early forms of communication using gestures and possibly vocalization. Thus, what is special about the human that enables him to produce, or if someone prefers, create a sign? The sign is a product of the scene and of origin, is both a product of the human mind and human brain. The brain performs many functions, that most important of which are perception, recognition and interpretation of sensory information, attention, maintaining concentration on a specific object, action or thought, memory, short-term and long-term, motor skills, mobilizing muscles and body, language and auditory processing, discriminating and understanding sounds, producing verbal signals, visual spatial processing, processing spatial relationship between objects, and exclusive problem-solving, decision-making, self-regulations of emotions. And all of them are present in the scene of origin. The human brain depends on thousands of nerve fibers that register muscle contractions and relaxation, but not even the echo of any violent activity of neurons reaches the human consciousness. Analyzing the movement of a hand, neurologist David Eagleman uses the research of Sherrington, a pioneer in neuroscience, who stated that if it weren't for a neurologist, he wouldn't have guessed the existence of nerves, muscles, and so on. As a result, he found that what he experiences as a movement is a product of the mind, which is not experienced, but the mind uses it to create human perception of events. Perception depends on consciousness, which is a product of nerve cells. As already mentioned, humans can open the door to the future. So let's continue asking, what's so special about the human brain? And again, what is special about the human brain which enables it to produce, or if someone prefers, create a sign? It all starts with unique human wiring. When we look at the brains of animals, we find the input and output right next to each other. There is a direct link between the two. So when an animal sees food, it leads to an instinctive reaction. The input, see food, is connected directly to the output, eat food. There is very little space in the brain between them, but humans can do something more. When it comes to food, people can simply eat, or they can also disengage their instincts. Seeing food is something outside the basic purpose. Human can perceive food as art, tool, or even weapon. Why? Because during the human evolution, there was an expansion of the brain regions between the input and output. In GA, in the case of the scene of origins, we have visual stimuli such as the central object, presence of a group, and organic potentials like the instinct of hunger and violence. So in the human brain, seeing something doesn't necessarily lead to an automatic response. Inputs can mix and collide with what's already there. The human brain can make new pathways, new connections. Humans can do and ideas, think about things, and what is the most important here, consider possibilities. The complexity of the human brain allows to process information, and it is almost limitless. The countless links in these networks, this is the foundation of human creativity, as well its products, like those known from the scene of origin, including a sign. The expansion of the human brain gave us another important creative advantage. With the enlargement of the human cortex came the expansion of the prefrontal cortex, the part behind the forehead, and this, as it turns out, is the source of human imagination and presumably all thinking. A human being has the power to imagine the world that isn't human yet and is able to consider the options before he decides what to do. The prefrontal cortex also allows humans to imagine what's not directly in front of us, but also that what is directly in front of us. So the expansion of the human brain during the evolution gave us the possibility to rise above our instincts and consider options before we decide what to do. Neurologists also claim that each decision, first of all, involves someone's past experience stored in our body. We usually mean memory, but it is also stored in our body. The present situation, but also mentioned predictions about the future, is human's characteristic. In the animal world, each creature is geared towards receiving a reward. Unlike animals, people do not expect only rewards that meet their basic needs, but also have abstract concept of a reward, such as the feeling of being valued by the community. And unlike animals, humans can put such a reward over biological needs. Only people can overcome the level of basic needs in deference to abstract ideas. Moreover, Merlin Donald argues that the enhanced attentional, metacognitive, and retrieval capacities that resulted from these changes made hominids immensely more capable of dealing with social complexity than their ancestors. He concludes that what drove the brain expansion was not the cognitive demands of tool making or spatial mapping of the environment, but the growth in the size of the social group that imposed greater demands on a memory. Eagleman in turn states that the brains are composed of multiple competing networks, each of which has own goals and desires, where the process of decision-making remains a neural parliament composed of rival political parties, which find it out to steer the ship of state. A human, as a complex creature, is composed of many drives, and all of them fight for control. In a decision-making process, the human brain always crushes ambiguity into choices, which is based on 0-1 system, the basis of brain operations. Inside the human brain, a simple choice causes an avalanche of activities. The decision-making process does not depend on individual neurons, but on a team of billions connected to each other. And the only thing one can observe is the reflection of a changing pattern in a large area of the brain. What is particularly interesting on an observable level, such in the scene of origin with the potential to fight for the central object, is that the brain itself constitutes a machine built from a conflict. It is an internal conflict between different parts of the brain, between the coalition of neurons. It is an intervening network of neurons which release chemicals that excite or depress each other and play many roles at different times in an ever-shifting interest groups, not necessarily being closely placed to each other. But if it comes to the specific arrangement and they actively cooperate and then the decision is made. So they must cooperate to take a decision. First they play and finally they find a solution. It remains like dispersed individuals, for example, linking online. The scene is not inscribed in human cognition, but it is not only described in human cognition, but it is also described in human brain. Here, I took one step backward to look at the mechanism explaining the possibility of occurring behaviors forming the scene of origin. This step was aimed at looking at the neurological neuronal properties of the human brains to which the scene of origin can exist. This time, the perception of the scene of origin was built not only on the postulation of pragmatism favored by Gans, but also on the empiricism seen in the neurological properties of the human brain. Besides the heuristic, hypothetical, and hypostatic potentials of the scene of origin, I wanted to argue that Gans's statement that the human being did not emerge from the state of nature because in fact he never left it, implies that the appearance of the scene of origin was prepared by possibilities of a human's cogito-corporeal system of the brain. The turn to the mankind would therefore mean to accept that the scene of origin is unique to humans, not animals, and that the knowledge of the objective of the scene is a hint for all the mankind. This is the way that should be followed to limit violence and allow the continuation of the scenic coexistence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marina. Really great paper, brave, courageous, ambitious, and I have no doubt that there will be at least a few questions. So I'm just seeing, I guess I need to go to gallery view so I can watch for hands. Okay, so thank you, Richard. Why don't you jump in and ask your question? I'll keep my eye on the gallery.
Thank you for the paper. I enjoyed it a great deal. Yeah, what is special about the human brain? I did think about this when I was in grad school and subsequently quite a lot, actually. And I know Andrew thought about it too. So, you know, I did, my reading's probably out of date, but there's a book that you might be interested in. It's, maybe you've already read it, Terence Deacon's The Symbolic Species. It's a great book, and Eric's written about it too. I've written about it. He makes a point that, I mean, there's basically an argument against Chomsky, who wants to say that, yeah, the brain is special because it has a language faculty, and it's language that's special about humans. But Deacon obviously agrees that humans are special in some way, biologically speaking. They, you know, it's hard to deny that they stand out from other large mammals, but he doesn't want to trace it back to the brain, because he says that's kind of a hopeful monster theory. You know, you just say, well, it's the brain that's different, because the brain, you know, had to evolve from something that was non-human at some point, like you're asking in your paper. But he cites a very interesting experiment by, I think, the primatologist is Sally Boysen. And the experiment it came to my mind when you were talking about, you know, the input, you perceive the food, and the output, you go get the food. So in this experiment, the Boysen presented chimpanzees with 2 piles of candy, and one was bigger than the other. And naturally, every chimpanzee took the bigger pile, just like a kid would. But then she complicated the experiment, and she made it so that the pile selected by the chimpanzee was given to another chimpanzee. So the chimps had to learn, in other words, to defer their own gratification, and they had to make this sort of logical sequence in their minds that if I pick the big pile, that's going to the other chimpanzee. So if I want the big pile, I have to pick the small pile. But they never managed to solve this problem, which was kind of curious, because chimpanzees are, you know, they're pretty good at causal chains of thinking, but Deacon speculates that it's the salience of the perception, right? Because the food is so overwhelming, you know, you just want to reach for it. Even a child could make this this logical. So he agrees with you when he says it's the prefrontal cortex that helps you to sever these perceptual links. But the interesting thing about his argument is that he says it's not the prefrontal cortex that causes the origin of the human. It's actually a feedback process, which you touched on, I think, in your paper about social group size. He says there's an ethical problem, and he comes up with a kind of scenario. It's not exactly.
Yes, that's what I wanted to say. Yes, precisely. We had, in fact, professor, neurologist, and he was doing biological and also physical studies. His name was Jerzy Vetulani. And he spoke about this problem of choices among primates. And he found out that there is something what you may call an ethical feelings, which animals already have. But those ethical feelings are usually not multi-choice. It is not a multi-choice situation which gives them possibility to choose something. If they would have much more, so they would be lost. But if it is a small choice, it is possible to take bigger or and be more egoistic, of course. But sometimes it even happens when there are 2 monkeys, and they are one monkey is giving a candle So another monkey sees that another one was given. So she feels very unhappy. So, and even when some monkeys see that the others were given that, so they fight for equality among the group to give all monkeys the same candle. So it exists something as ethical system among monkeys already, but it is not as multi-choices as it is among humans. It's more simple. It's more simple because this area of creation, this area of possibility to imagine, to create, is much more smaller than in the case of humans.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a lot of links, but still human is a little bit different. And of course, the problem of many different reactions, influences, what influences prefrontal cortex, it never ends, because whenever they find some solution, so immediately they find that it is not stopped yet. There is another problem which opens this level. So it never stops. It's something fascinating, you see. It's something absolutely fascinating, because neurology, of course, they work on experiments, on these EEG measurements, and those measurements are also sometimes not very, it is not very easy to catch this very, very small moment of time, which really should influence your final results. And now they are not sure if that what they measured was totally representing the moment when you take a decision to choose this or another way. So it is not so easy, but even though the progress is constant. But on this level, it is simple to say if something is bigger or smaller. But on this level, everybody agrees that human has got bigger brain, and this area which is a space between input and output, it's the most characteristic for human being.
I want to mention the subtitle is called "The Co-Evolution of Language in the Brain," and so his thesis is that it's the brain only grows in response to the language problem. So the driver is not the brain; the driver is language. And he says at one point that humans became humans, I'm paraphrasing, because of an idea. So it's very abstract in that sense. It's not there's not a direct cause on the neuronal level that caused the uniqueness of human cognition. That's a radical hypothesis. Radical for an empirical scientist.
Language lies on both sides, on cognitive as well as neurocognitive levels. That's why this operation is very complicated as the scene itself, because the scene, it is not only these three elements. In each of those elements, there are so many new connections which are working with each other. Of course, our comprehension is like that, but it is much more complicated. But language lies on both sides, not as other elements. Language is specific, but this specificity is related to possibilities of these functions which are in this big part of human brain, which is not an animal brain, because they don't have it.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is great. I just wish we had more time. The time for that half of the session is gone, I think. And so there might be opportunities at the end of Ian's session if people want to jump in or connect the two papers. But thank you so much, Magdalena. Thank you, Richard, for the question. And Ian will go next. I'll introduce our next speaker. I'm going to be reading exactly the same introduction that was read earlier today, but that's okay. Ian Dennis is a professor of English at the University of Ottawa, and Secretary Treasurer of the Generative Anthropology Society and Conference. The author of 4 published novels, of the Girardian study, Nationalism and Desire in Early Historical Fiction, Macmillan, 1997, and of Lord Byron and the History of Desire, University of Delaware Press, 2009. The Byron book is a work of literary criticism making use of both mimetic theory and GA. Ian was the chief organizer of the 2009 GA conference in Ottawa and co-organizer at UCLA in 2013 and in New York City in 2019. He's currently working on a book of GA theory, tentatively titled Varieties of Aesthetic Experience, from which the present article is excerpted. So Ian, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Before I'm going to do some PowerPoint, but before I do, I'd like to, I've had the great good fortune in when I'm preparing this paper to have had expert advice. And I'd like to briefly introduce my WWE consultant. If you just lean forward, this is Teo Dennis, who knows far more about it than me, and he'll stick around. And if you give me difficult questions during the question period, he's certainly going to be able to help me. Anyway, let me see if I can share the screen here. Can you see that okay? Okay, it's good. So I found it a bit challenging to connect my paper to our theme this year. My book project, as Andrew's just mentioned, is on the varieties, not of religious, as in William James's famous title, but of aesthetic experience. And I'm currently attempting a chapter on the aesthetics of sport. Though doing so might stress the term a bit or make it merely metaphorical, there does seem some justification for talking about the ritualistic aspect of sports, and particularly of professional wrestling. But is there really any way to relate such secular or pseudo-ritual to anything strictly or explicitly religious? After some searching, I'm afraid this was the best I could manage. Meet Amish roadkill. Pro wrestlers, be it noted, are all superstars, but roadkill was, well, only minor super, a little blip of light that went nova in about 2012 and is hard to imagine now even as a smallish black hole, maybe rather a shapeless clump of cinder afloat in the trackless virtual emptiness. Still, you could look him up. He had his devotees. They relished his lowness. Generative anthropology, of course, as befits our universalist claims, has no brief to assess worth, depth, validity, and so on, no high and low on the originary scene. Instead, center and periphery, love and resentment. What provokes desire, what prevents violence, or doesn't. We countenance it all. Still, especially at an event hosted from the homeland of the great Abrahamic religions, one must tread carefully. Can we justify the term ritual in the stricter context of this conference? One can now make professional wrestling a subject of potentially serious study. A body of scholarship has sprung up. Some, of course, detect oppressions. Others, eyeing the authenticating demographics of its audience, rush to recuperate the operation as vibrant popular culture, unblushingly cataloged with minstrel shows, vaudeville, and jazz. Jazz! Duke Ellington and Hulk Hogan, Thelonious Monk, and Amish roadkill. Others still see tokens of identity, elected affinities, patterns of individual or collective of consumption, slumming or aficionado, coerced or freely chosen as one may decide, or both coerced and freely chosen, as ironized consumerism, at once oppressive on their part, as after all, money does change hands, and emancipatory on ours, seeing it for what it is. What is a ritual in such a context? And what of the odd, possibly ironic ritualism of pro wrestling? One can ironize rites and rituals, one can parody them, but if one goes through those motions, is it still ritual? Does it still perform ritual functions? GA's concept of ritual, I take to be deliberate, repetition of the originary event with substitutions. When the effects of the emission of the first sign, less violence, better access to the object of desire, were remembered, the actions of the scene were repeated, now in the presence and under the threatened interdiction of the sacred force which had seemingly created those effects the first time. Signing, hesitation to appropriate, at least minimally regulated and egalitarian access to the object, sparagmos. It's being remembered that makes it, if minimally, deliberate, even if the operation is variously understood by participants across time and space. Rites are also communal, shared as the sign is shared, performed. Ritual was and remains something done, and as with the sign, necessarily done in the explicit or implicit presence of human others. The best wrestling scholarship is able to distract itself from the provoking spectacle of string pulling and profit making to register that the audience is doing something, deliberately and consciously participating in the ritual, not just witnessing others, priests, performing it. For example, these scholars point out a vigorous call and response structure, gestures, roars of approval or disapproval. Outcomes are at times affected, scripts changed. Above all, satisfactions, victories, defeats are openly, vociferously communal. The audience, all of it, partakes, shares in the sparagmos. The live audience, first and foremost, but the virtual audience also through various media interventions. A GA-inflected analysis might begin by noting not just these structural commonalities, but the decidedly sacrificial character of the operation. This is, of course, one point at which GA diverges from Girardian mimetic theory. For the latter, the sacrifice is firstly and always potentially of human life. For GA, it is only of human centrality. On our originary scene, no one dies. Participants do, however, sacrifice immediate appropriation of the desirable object, making do, temporarily, with the virtual centrality and actual peripherality of the sign, and the imagined gratifications it summons. The object of desire, shared, is not, or is no longer, the imagined object of universal desire and private appropriation, however. It is a kind of fake, actually, although it may provide nutritional and other benefits. But it is not the thing made real by mediated desire, only a replacement or shadow or token thereof. It has to do, though, and nobody dies. We might call these two outcomes the degree zero of human communal solidarity. Making do, nobody dies. In WW rituals, of course, nobody dies either. Well, my advisor has mentioned to me that there have been some accidents. There are often scapegoats, though, who suffer or seem to, but they do not really die or become transfigured, usually. The bouts are scripted, yes, staged, faked, if you must, although things do happen, as they do, for example, in film pornography. Porn actors tell us that the difference between sex on camera and in private is that with the public type, there must be, visibility. Embraces or other actions by peripheral body parts mustn't obscure the essentials. And much the same is true of throws and blows in the pro wrestling ring. All such actions are visible because every recipient is, at the moment of attack, passive and helpless. There is no confusing simultaneity of struggle, no furious mutual exchange of strikes or successful or unsuccessful attempts to fend off punches, as in, say, boxing. Each wrestler is, by turn, pure victim and pure oppressor. That is, the spectacle is sacrificial down to its minutest elements. However, if such things are happening, they're not changing anything. These might be the minimal requirements of aesthetic experience. Things happen, nothing changes. The bared bodies, shaved hairless from the neck down, shining and oiled, indeed beautiful, clad only the men, usually in what might as well be called a loincloth, perhaps make Christian analogy inescapable. Sometimes tables or other props stand in for crosses. The fans might chant, "Crucify him," except it's probably too many syllables. And besides, these are actually quite peaceable people, often families, and only there for fun. In his famous essay on wrestling, Roland Barthes evokes a pagan sacrificial past, the great solar spectacles, Greek drama and bullfights, I quote. But that was wrestling in the 1950s. Now one might more plausibly think of Christian painting, bared bodies strewn in spectacular pathos or animated with titanic cruelty. Instead of a dynamic flow of action, the dominant impression, at least for me, is of a sequence of static tableau, intelligible moments, Barthes astutely calls them, set up with little bursts of activity that feel, again, to me, a little bit like the rapid changing of scenery on a stage. As each vision is created, there is a pause to allow the audience to take it in and admire. This is augmented on video, of course, with instant replays. Even in motion, even live, there is something halcyon about it. Ballet is like this too. Ballerinas, frozen forever at the apex of their jeté. But unlike ballet, which does, when done well, balance stasis and motion, I think WWE may actually look better in still photos than live or filmed. Again, though, nobody dies, even fictionally, as in religious paintings. The atmosphere is carnivalesque, not holy. And if there is ethical content, it is no longer what Barthes calls the great spectacle of suffering, defeat, and justice. Or not so much, or not in the same way. Certain motions are still gone through, certain story premises are entertained, but really, these are pretexts, means to construct narratives. Wrestling and its fans are quite blissfully indifferent to justice. When I began to watch a decade or so ago with my then young son, I thought I knew, as Barthes and everybody else knew, clever demystifiers that we were, what it was really about. I anticipated tossing about terms like baby faces and heels, kayfabe and marks, deploring or groaning at the simplistic defeats of hostile foreign others by avatars of white American manliness. What I found, however, is that much of this has disappeared or being transformed. In particular, the national melodrama seems largely extinct. Cynics say this is because the WWE has gone global and wants to avoid offending any of its new or future customers. WWE, by the way, stands for World Wrestling Entertainment. And although it's not the only game in the global village, it's the biggest. And for simplicity's sake, I just refer to the one corporation. Anyway, the Sheik, not when we're playing Saudi Arabia. Of course, it's an aspect of a broader problem for many, shall we call them, low forms. With what can they replace the old standbys of ethnic slurs and jokes? Economic globalism, as much as political correctness, has made this an issue. Who can we safely and profitably dump on? Whose comeuppances can we openly enjoy, but also whose triumphs? WWE is working on that, and what we might call its invitations to love and resentment are mutating in interesting ways. If rituals always do something, that something for WWE is producing outcomes. But unlike those produced by other sporting or religious rituals, theirs are not essentially the same each time. Instead, although to a degree self-contained and always at a simple level intelligible, the outcomes of individual matches are features of and advance longer narratives and cannot be fully appreciated without knowledge of these finally rather unpredictable sequences of events. These larger narratives are also fictions, centrally concerned with characters. The wrestlers are or play characters, and the audience engages often quite intensely with their personalities and destinies. If the older analogy for pro wrestling was always to drama, or indeed to melodrama, stage play, now the typical fan seems to seek and enjoy a more novelistic experience, or perhaps one similar to that produced by episodic television series. Like a novelist, the WWE has a number of storytelling means at its disposal. There is, for example, the commentary from announcers. These are notably unreliable narrators, though, and are often reduced to minimally choric functions. The most common utterance of the play-by-play guides is, "Oh no." Their main talent, indeed, is to pronounce these two words with straight-faced dread. A wrestler picks up a folding chair and stalks towards a fallen and helpless opponent, features fixed in an expression of murderous malignancy. Oh no. I really can't do it, but they're good at it. Characters make dramatic entrances, packed with signs and symbols down runways similar to those used at high fashion shows. They make sometimes morose, sometimes triumphant exits, demonstrating assorted inner qualities or absences thereof. Each has an appropriate theme song and a penumbra of acolytes, props, and other paraphernalia, some of it marketable. Backstage encounters, quarrels, and so forth are reported or directly broadcast. And other kinds of programming allow one to follow developing plots. And the fans themselves, through social media and their own online vehicles of various kinds, paratexts, constantly relate, critique, and push forward the narratives. Indeed, fans are both part of the story and out of the complete control of any given narrator. So, perhaps the WWE is a kind of partly non-fiction novel, one that unfolds in real time, or shall we say is narrated in the present tense. As fans well know, not everything that occurs is fully under narrative control. They treasure the unpredictable, the unscripted, and gleefully share amongst themselves video collections of such happenings. Certain wrestlers, for example, operate in an ambiguous terrain, straddling the fully scripted and original or improvisational, or some semi-deliberate combination of the two. A recent example is the highly popular storyline of Bray Wyatt, who, it seems largely on his own initiative, constructed an elaborate narrative that had him alternate between a destructive cult leader and a possibly unhinged and menacing children's television host. Then further mutate into a gothic terror called The Fiend, and finally recapitulate this trajectory in a video match that included a scathingly satirical critique of the company and a gloating mockery of one of its leading babyfaces, John Cena, whose much more limited thespian skills were mercilessly reduced to one long look of consternation and guilt. Fans who could read its every detail in depth were in ecstasies. If the wrestlers sometime or ostensibly create their own narratives, so also and always can younger fans in play. A wide range of collectible figures can be used to reenact bouts, imagine new ones, change outcomes. The aesthetic satisfactions of miniature replication seem to me fascinating. I always have, actually. It's something I've always been interested in, want to write about maybe sometime, as are the kinds of play and the kinds of love they facilitate. But for the moment, I'll just note the structural parallel and the sense of participatory ownership. Finally, all true fans will tell you that even if scripted, the physical activities in and around the ring are demanding and dangerous. The actual difficulty of the throws and leaps and so forth, and the reality of the injuries sustained are in a sense assertions of independence. The narrator can propose, but only the wrestlers dispose, and no script ever included an actual injury, although these happen with a frequency comparable to those in many real sports. In all these cases, what is loved is the unpredictability, the uncertainty of central control, and a gleeful imagined defiance or replacement of the ordering power. Still, nobody wants that power. A WWE match is a place to relax into the pleasures of fatalism. One does not know who's going to win. That would be boring, because the narrator does retain that immediate power. But one does know that whoever wins, it will be fake, I'm supposed to say, however, fictional, and won't matter, although except in the fiction. A particularly obvious trope is the ladder match, in which the object of desire, a championship belt or just money, is hung aloft and the wrestlers struggle first to erect and then mount a folding ladder to seize it. Of course, it takes many attempts, many last-moment tumbles as rivals seize the climber from below or bowl over the whole construction. Someone finally does win. It seems an even more arbitrary an outcome than most, but the whole process closely resembles the children's game of snakes and ladders, with its nice simulacrum of a deterministic world. We come then to the most paradoxical feature of these rituals. Unlike, say, celebrants at a Catholic mass, fans resent openly the centralized power of the narrators, the WWE brass and their writers and planners. They know perfectly well that outcomes are fixed or faked, and that they usually have a pretty good idea of why the bosses, or the capital A authority as they call them, put in the fixes or scripts they do. They vigorously, that's the fans I mean, impatiently critique and second guess the narrator's artistic designs, even as they unfold. They delight when events go off script in the various ways they do, and yet they return, they watch, they rant, they cheer, they scoff, even if often not on cue. Nobody is wrapped here, nobody is under a spell, but they come above all, they pay. They create a center, and then they share it. Another short summation of what occurs in all ritual, again in reiteration of the originary scene. It does happen in the context of a market or exchange economy, but it doesn't feel much like buying a car or a house. Nor do the pieties of build it and they will come or the ilk quite work. The coming largely is the building here. There's indeed a whiff of the atavistic, even the archaic, as Barth suggests, of something unstable, volatile, that intimates the pre-market world with all its dangers and unpredictable violences. But it's only a whiff. Eric Gans has described the fundamental operation of the scene as tragic, or at least as a tragedy for desire, and one may certainly concede this underlying perspective. The tragedy of the human scene is the impossibility of the full gratification of desire, the substitution of the fake for the real, the agonizing compromise of human sociality. I used this phrase earlier today, but I just didn't think it works okay. We can't ever really get what we want. And what the authority tells us we need is a poor substitute. Who really wants to share? Hell is other people. And yet, we come, they come, end up sharing, even sometimes call it a celebration. WWE fans come, though, with that only conditional willingness to concede the public center. They come brimming with resentments, demonstrating those resentments, asserting the role of those resentments, asserting a kind of ownership, scoffing at the claims to independence of the center. They come in the certainty of their power, paying to relinquish that power, paying to resent relinquishing it. It's not originary resentment, of course. Fans know perfectly well that the rebarbative center is not guarded by a sacred force, but occupied, usurped by human rivals, and eminently resistible ones. And yet, for the nonce, they're willing, periodically, fictionally, to concede its putative omnipotence, pay it the tribute of both their resentment and their love, allow it with a kind of gleeful disregard for its nominal control to unveil its only minimally inscrutable designs. Perhaps this paradoxical posture reflects something quite basic about this kind of ritual, perhaps about all rituals or pseudo-rituals now. They are performed in the belief that there is not, nor can be, tragedy. Unlike other sporting events, WWE bouts never end tragically for anyone. Not even with heartbreak do they end. And I have to say, a brief shout out to Matt Schneider. His household and mine are both in mourning right now as a result of certain very unfortunate hockey results in the last little while. But our heartbreak is, WWE fans never leave a WWE match in mourning. I don't think they do. We are confronted finally by a very odd ritual indeed, in which the celebrants seem to be gathering around an admittedly ersatz public center in order to celebrate the absence of a real one, to partake of a sacrilegious sparagmos, to celebrate or reimagine, that is, an imminent paradise of autonomous desire. A celebration of the feebleness of the public center. I don't know if you can hear this. I've got a street cleaning machine going on right now. Anyway, a celebration of the feebleness of the public center, of the lowness of its rights, through a cheerfully debased parody of ancient forms, surely implies a sort of affirmation of market life, of the power of the consumer, an understanding of the fictionality of all centers, including those established around personal identities. It remembers in order deliberately to forget, carnival following rather than preceding Lent. It imagines the coexistence and satisfaction of all desires. It recreates the scene, but in an exuberantly triumphalist comic mode. And it thus recovers the originary priority of the aesthetic, of beauty over fear, of imagined possession over sacred inviolability. It resents happily, tolerantly, out of love. Now, whether or how much such an operation contributes to contemporary human safety or flourishing is quite another question. Maybe you can tell me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Just there we go. Back to the gallery view. Thank you so much, Ian. I just want to make one comment before we get to questions that you've proved that it is possible to have a paper that makes people laugh out loud. At least I laughed out loud more than once. Thank you so much for that. It's kind of a shame that we were all virtually muted. I expect you would have heard, you know, some multiple laughter at different points with the images accompanying the text. So without further ado, please, anyone who has a question or a comment, raise your hand or unmute yourself and I can call on you to jump in. I'm looking. I'm not seeing anyone right away. So I guess I'll go first to get things rolling. So to one little quotation, things happen, nothing changes. And you know, it's a wonderfully positive and affirming and non-judgmental celebration of wrestling as a, you know, a kind of love, or at least something that's productive of love. But I just wondering, what would you do with, and it's not, honestly, it's not me, I don't think, because I like the way the paper goes, but if the moralizing tendency that some critics of wrestling might have, how would you respond to them? That's one question. Then the other question I had was more epistemological, because I remember when I was a kid, I loved wrestling and watched it, you know, with great enthusiasm. And people would tell me it's fake, it's fake. And I just didn't believe them. I just said, no, it's not. And then at some point that changed. And it was almost like no longer believing in Santa Claus. And that's not really any, I don't know if there's anywhere in the paper where you talk about what's the cognitive state of fans of wrestling? What's the kind of belief that's involved in their participation? Because presumably to create the kind of emotional charge for the fans, there'd have to be, they have to be trusting at some level.
Well,
I'll just
like
leave it there.
Like I said, things happen. It's not like things don't happen. And I mean, the you know, the analogy of Santa Claus and belief in him is perfectly natural. And I would have said that if you hadn't, sort of thing, in response to your question. If you go back to your point about asking about moralizing side of it, I mean, surely this is an old struggle between the aesthetic and the moralizing. I mean, someone said earlier in this conference that René Girard, whose name we were bringing up many times, just didn't have an aesthetic theory, though. I mean, he was a moralist ultimately, wasn't he? I mean, and you know, novels were either no good because they were romantique, or they told you the truth because they were Romanesque. You know, and clearly, I doubt he was much of a WWE fan, or you know, whereas, you know, that's again none of those reasons. And Chris, in my talk earlier, I was saying this is why I'm a Gansian. Well, one of the reasons I'm a Gansian, I guess, again, is because the aesthetic is central to the scene, and so this is essentially, again, to me, that little definition, you know, something happened. How did I put it?
Things happen, nothing changes.
Something happens, nothing changes. Well, you know, isn't that the point of, you know, what we were talking about earlier in this conference, the interior scene, or the inner scene of representation? Something happens, you imaginatively attain the object of desire, but nothing happens. You know, you don't actually grab it, because then you get killed. And so this is, you know, it's the aesthetic operation most centrally. It surely is the question of fake or not fake. I mean, I was sort of trying to provocatively talk about the, you know, the object on the scene of representation, when the originary scene, when you finally do get it, is kind of fake, because it's not the whole thing that you initially wanted. But, you know, I'm being provocative, but, you know, for fans, the fake, non-fake is not the issue. What's the issue is the narrative, right? The story. and the characters, and how interesting are they? Plus, as compared to a novel, even some of the innovative novels where you put your own chapters together or something, compared to a novel, the fan has more involvement here. Constant chanting, rejecting by fans of given choices made by the narrator have changed outcomes. And there's a fellow called Daniel Bryan whom the fans loved, and the brass, the authority, didn't ever seem to want to promote, and they kind of forced their hand. They made him promote them. So, but at the same time, they don't run the whole show. The fans don't, and they don't want to. That would take the fun out of it. What's going to happen, and you're going to turn the page. The next page is coming along. And it is kind of, it's a celebration of guilt-free narrative or guilt-free aesthetic pleasure, right? As I say, I really think that the talk of justice that is sort of the old standby of intellectuals when they're talking about, ever since Roland Barthes, whose essay, incidentally, I recommend to everyone if you don't remember it. It's just a fabulous little piece. But ever since, they've been thinking, yeah, these are sort of morality plays. Well, I don't think they're morality plays particularly. For one thing, fans will cheer just as hard when the heel wins as when the babyface wins, often harder. Apparently, Toronto, my sort of hometown, has a reputation, the WWE fans in Toronto have a reputation for stridently, forcefully, and consistently booing the baby faces and cheering the heels. Changes the operation.
I think Matthew might have a question. Is that correct, Matthew? I'm assuming that because you're unmuted. Yeah, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you, Ian. That was a lot of fun. And I've always wondered exactly how it is that that wrestling has acquired the kind of fan base that it has, but I think you really put your finger right on it with the idea of the narrative. But that leads me to ask, is that the difference between wrestling and a sport more traditionally conceived, or as we understand it? When we go to a hockey game, obviously we want an outcome, we want our team to win, but we cannot allow even the possibility that they don't win or do win through scripted means, right?
Yep.
So is wrestling a sport then, or is it a hybrid or some sort of new creation that occupies a place between the kind of, I'm not sure what word to use other than purity, the purity of athletic competition and the aesthetics of storytelling on the other hand?
It's sports entertainment is what they call it. And ballet, for example, requires substantial athleticism as well. And just as in WWE, fans of ballet will appreciate and critique the quality of the athleticism of the moves, of the actions, and so forth. But ballet has a much more fixed sort of outcome. One of the beauties of WWE is that by comparison to, if you've seen Swan Lake before, you know how it ends, but you never know how a WWE match is going to end. So yeah, there's some hybridity going on in there. But as I say, I think the fact that there is a planned scripted outcome drains the operation of its tragedy, of its potential for tragedy. And as I say, you and I and my son know only too well right now. But I guess obviously there's a matter of taste. I mean, this is one entertainment amongst thousands in the market world, and it's a matter of taste. One's tolerance for that degree of uncertainty, that degree of scriptedness, and so forth, it will determine whether you're a fan of this stuff or not. But I don't know, does that answer your question?
I think this has been such a good session. Thank you both, Marina and Ian. But if we close now, it just turned 10:30, and we now have a 5-minute break, and then we'll be 5 minutes behind the clock. But I think let's thank our two speakers, and we'll reconvene in 5 minutes at 10:35. That's my time, whatever your time is.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Marina. Sorry, thank you, Magdalena, not Marina. Thank you.
Thank you. Be back in 5 minutes, all right?